Let me just begin by saying thank you for engaging with this study. This book was a labor of love and also of kind of emptying all of the expectations that I have to show that I know so much or that I have to speak a certain language, and instead trying to really go from the heart, because that is where a lot of our conversations get stuck, in the sense that we're really good at learning new things and speaking new languages sometimes, but getting to the language of the heart and being able to speak with one another about difficult issues is something that I've been trying to work on with the communities that I've been working with. So you read the first 3 chapters or so of the book. I'd love to hear first any questions or comments or pushback that you have so far in what you've read.
I'll ask about the chapter 3, racial identity theory. You had mentioned somewhere earlier that was from someone, or is that from you, the stages?
No, those stages are from the racial identity development theory of Beverly Daniel Tatum and Janet Helms. Janet Helms is at Boston College, and Beverly Daniel Tatum is the former president of Spelman College. And Beverly Daniel Tatum's book that is really accessible is called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race?" So her book kind of goes through racial identity development theory in a really helpful way. And before I read that book, I had read an article by her that talked about how she used it in the classroom with her college-age students. So she, at the time, was teaching college courses on the psychology of race. And she let people know ahead of time these stages of racial identity development and the different kind of emotional reactions all of them may have to having these conversations. And she tracked along with them with journals that they had to turn in throughout the semester. And she noticed that students would be able to notice, here's when I want to withdraw from the conversation, but I know that's a natural part of the process, so I'm going to stay engaged. And so she was able to see how talking about these, these developmental stages was a way of letting people know that the different emotions that you're going through are shared. It's not your experience alone, and that the end goal isn't just you feeling bad or you feeling guilty. We need to kind of keep working through this so that we can develop into a deeper community. So I really recommend her work to you. Her book has been it was originally published in the 90s, but has come out with a more recent edition. So I really recommend that to you.
Carolyn, I know most people here know at least a little bit about your background and your interest, and your PhD dissertation was on whiteness and preaching, right? Mm-hmm. What would you say, like, if you could just kind of sum up your background a little bit for people here that might not know too much about you? How did you become interested in studying, racism in a more formal way in your academic work, and then kind of into what you do now, and what I feel like you've done really well with this book is bringing that experience to just a broader audience of people?
Yeah, sure. So I share a little bit about this in the book, about how I was called to ministry when I was about 15, but I've been growing up in predominantly white neighborhoods and churches, and all through my growing up, even though I was surrounded by Christian community, people who wanted to do good in the world, there was still this silence about the ongoing impact of racism on our brothers and sisters, also in the community in which we lived. And so when I got to seminary after college, and first was kind of had my eyes open, I was reading Dolores Williams at the time, and I was just shocked that I had gone through so much education in a Christian setting and Christian formation, and hadn't yet been able to recognize the ongoing reality of racism. And one of the things that I think as people of faith we tend to do is we want to look at the pain of the world and try to do what we can to address it. And for me as a white person, it felt so painful to talk about this, and I didn't know how to talk about it with the white communities that I had come out of and that I might serve in future contexts. So at first it was just a question that kept coming up. How do I talk about this? How do I bring this back? And I worked for a year on the U.S.-Mexico border as a chaplain in Yuma, Arizona. And, again, seeing race play out in so many different ways in that environment, and the impact of our nation's past history with Native Americans and the two Native American tribes that are there, and the literally deadly impact of people crossing the border and being chased by ICE agents. All of that was just really, really present during that time. And then I served at church in San Antonio, which is where I grew up. And so it was home territory. And during that time, I was kind of getting my kind of feet wet in ministry, experiencing what it's like to be a pastor, being an ordained. But still that question just kept coming up. How do I talk about racism when we as a church are reaching out to the northeast side of San Antonio and not reaching just across the street to the neighborhood that's becoming more predominantly Black and Hispanic? What's going on, and how do we change? And a lot of what I heard at the time was, well, we don't think they would be interested in what we have to offer. There's these justifications that people have for saying we think people who look like us will have the most in common with us and be interested. So I didn't know how to really go into those conversations. So forward, I went to Princeton Seminary, where I worked for 3 years as associate director of admissions. So I was in administration, and you're sitting around the admissions table. And again, you're talking about diversity. You're talking about wanting to increase diversity on campus of the seminary. And yet, what is the atmosphere of the seminary? Is it hospitable to people who come from different backgrounds? Once we bring people here, are we being effective in helping them feel welcomed and every bit a part of the community? So again, these questions came up, and that's when I found that article by Beverly Daniel Tatum about the impact of racial identity development on students in the classroom. And for me, it was kind of this light bulb, like, oh, shame and guilt don't have to be the end result of this. Like, there's still more processing that we can go through and find some other end point, some other sense of community. And so I started doing more research then. I did a THM while I was working at Princeton Seminary. And then I had to do a PhD. It wasn't because I knew I needed to be a seminary teacher. It was just this question needed to be answered in a more kind of systematic way for me. So I went to Emory University, where I was able to take classes from across disciplines in linguistic anthropology. Found out about a woman named Jane Hill, who wrote a book called The Everyday Language of White Supremacy. She talks about mock Spanish and the ways that mock Spanish has a way of passing on kind of racist ideas. When people say mañana, mañana, as a way of conveying a whole lot of information about assumptions of persons who are Spanish speaking putting things off. So that's just one example. But so a lot of great resources, and I don't need to tell you all the great resources that I studied during that time. But the one thing that kind of brought everything together for me as I'm trying to kind of unpack what I saw was the problem was this threefold process of recognition, which was the challenge of recognizing racism, just how challenging that is for us to really understand, for us to know what it looks like, what it feels like. Second, that self piece, that identity piece, recognizing ourselves as racialized, recognizing ourselves through this lens of racial identity development. What does that mean? How do we address the emotions that come with this? And then the third piece was, how do we recognize a response? how do we respond in light of what we're learning? And so that third piece, and this is from a book that I was reading by Paul Ricoeur on the Course of Recognition. And at the end, he talks about this gift exchange, this recognition as gratitude. And it was a real eye-opening experience for me to think, wow, what if we conceived of these hard conversations as a gift exchange? Which means even if I know it's going to be hard for me to enter into this space, even if I know that I'm nervous and I'm worried I'm going to say the wrong thing, that if I anticipate gratitude, if I anticipate I'm going to feel grateful at the other side of this, I'm much more empowered to attend, to show up, to be engaged. And likewise, to think that you yourself are bringing a gift, that you have a gift to bring into this conversation. As a white person, you know, there was a lot that I felt that I just shouldn't be part of these conversations. As someone who doesn't experience racial discrimination, then that's not my place to talk about this. As someone who doesn't know it from the inside, but hearing again and again from people of color who say, we are tired of being the ones to educate white people, and two, we don't always know how to talk about it. You know, nobody trains us how to talk about this either, and so don't expect us to educate everyone else. So realizing that this is a skill set. This is a skill set. Talking about these difficult subjects, and the fact that it's always in flux. What we talk about as race and racism, it keeps popping up and rearing its head in new forms, and we have to constantly be kind of re-evaluating how we talk about it, so that people can really see what's going on. So understanding that this is a skill set that needs to be taught and learned again and again, just like keeping up with a hobby that you have, or another skill set that you have, you got to keep working at it. And what I hope in my work to do is to train that back part of your brain, that central part, that amygdala that goes off with the fight or flight response when you're afraid or when you feel threatened, when you feel a sense of nervousness. I'm hoping that in our conversations that we can train that amygdala to just tone it down just a little bit, just to not have that same reactivity, to embody a way to sit with one another in our embodied experiences, to sit with our feelings, to receive the feelings that others have, and to be able to stay in that space long enough to engage in relationship. So those are some of the goals, some of the kind of roundabout journey that I've taken. I'm sorry, it's a little bit late, so I may be a little more scattered in my speech than I say.
Great.
But yeah, great question. Is there another question?
Carolyn, I told them to bring questions. So. Just so that
we actually wrote questions. So first, before we even started, or when we started with the intro, we wrote questions, anxieties, and things we were hoping to get out of it. And I actually have a question that somebody else wrote that stuck with me. But one of the questions somebody raised in the first week was, is there anything in our church structures that we need to address in order to kind of like, be anti-racist, to kind of, and have you learned anything from your work and engagement with congregations through this book that you see our churches need to work on?
That is such a great question. And it's really a deep, it's a deep problem, because when we talk about churches, we're talking about a long history where the churches that we know now started because of segregation and keeping African Americans out of congregations. And so now that churches are more integrated, but they're still very segregated, how do we talk about race in those spaces? there's a great book by Joseph Bart called Becoming an Anti-Racist Church. And he's worked with Crossroads Anti-Racism Ministry for many years. And he kind of talks about some different ways. My second book is coming out in December called Preaching About Racism, A Guide for Faith Leaders. And one of the things I talk about is this idea of racial identity development needs to happen in our churches too, because as a whole church, we need to kind of understand the depth of this problem. So how do we talk about sin, a word that's been misused and used hurtfully? How can we reclaim sin language to help us unpack the real pain and harm that racism has caused in our society and continues to have? So I have some suggestions in there for that. But I think it really happens at the local level. You know, I think it really happens where you are in your space, unpacking the history of your own space, unpacking your own beginnings and saying, where did we start? What was the original kind of impetus for our community beginning? And then how can we continue to do the things that we do best? And how can we change things to make room for the gifts of others? Because if this is really a gift exchange, you know, we really open ourselves to the gifts of others, because so often part of the legacy of racism is that we only look to certain individuals as being gifted. You know, certain people are the ones that we assume already have these gifts. So how do we open our eyes to see how each of us have been gifted and different communities have been gifted in different ways? So I'd be really interested as you all continue in your journey, because I know you already are a really inclusive church. So I'll be interested to hear how you want to push it forward and are going ahead with that. Other questions?
Plenty of questions, so
I'm curious about the idea of guilt. We're reading your book. We've read another article. We were talking about it earlier. I know as a white male, I've experienced maybe a sense of defensiveness, but I don't know whether I would associate it with the word guilt. And I'm curious, like maybe is the guilt element more of an experience that people from the South have because of slavery, Confederacy? I don't know. I mean, when you mentioned you were from Texas, I didn't know that before this, but when you mentioned that, I was wondering, is that why that word guilt is part of, because I don't know, as a Californian raised here, that's not the word. I don't feel good about the racism. How should I feel guilt?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it has to do with the language we grow up with. So if you grew up with a lot of sin language, as I did in some of the kind of Fellowship of Christian Athletes kind of organizations that I was part of, there was a lot of sin language, and so sin and guilt kind of would go together. You felt guilty for your sin. But in those days, what was sinful was considered like drinking or being promiscuous, I mean, like those were the sins, that kids could commit. But we didn't talk about, this historic legacy of racism and slavery and Jim Crow and all of the other ways that we other and marginalize people. But I think it's that sense, it may not be guilt, but it's that sense of I've done something wrong, or that sense that I feel guilty for having the white privilege that I have, or, that I can walk into a space and not have people assume that I'm a threat. Sometimes it's those kind of reactions. It's to learning about things and that makes us feel like all of a sudden we're bad people, or, without intending to, we are kind of crossing over something. And so those feelings are very uncomfortable, in that they don't reflect the rest of our vision of ourselves. We feel like, well, in all of these other ways, I'm a good person, so how could this person feel that I was being racist in what I just said? So it's constantly kind of being aware of the feelings that may come up, and each of us have our own different kind of responses depending on our own upbringing and our own part of the country where we grew up. Exactly. You know, people growing up in different parts have very different experiences and different ages. If you came about of age during the integration of schools, you know, a lot of people that I talk to, they're like, I was part of my high school when it was first integrated. I mean, people telling us about these kinds of, you know, stories and experiences. So all of that impacts our conversation and how we relate to this subject. But whatever those responses are, my hope is that we can sit with the discomfort longer than we may want to, and so that we can stay in that conversation and stay engaged.
Carolyn, it seems like you use kind of the power of story a lot in order to talk about racism. How do you see, I'd love to hear you talk about the role of story and the power it has to help us talk about racism.
Yeah. Stories are so powerful. I'm with my family, I'm listening to Harry Potter for the, like, I don't know, 5th time. It's ridiculous. My kids are like all the time, Harry Potter. So we're listening to the audiobook version again. But there's something about story that transports you into another experience. And as you're listening to a story, you're starting to picture yourself, you know, within the character's shoes. You're starting to imagine a different world, a different reality. And so when we listen to other people's stories, it enables us to experience the world a little differently. Is it Maria Lugones who wrote World Traveling? She talked about how different kinds of world traveling. So she talked about how, you know, sharing stories is a way of traveling into different worlds. And that's really stuck with me as a way, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And sharing our own story is important because our stories constantly change. We have one kind of story that we may tell about ourselves that at some later point in our lives, we kind of open up and say, oh, well, that's maybe not the story I want to keep telling. This is the way that I want to reframe that story. And in this conversation, particularly for white people, it's really important that we look at this history of racism and we say, even though I don't feel connected to those people who did these terrible things, somehow I am connected and implicated in this larger system. And yet that doesn't have to be the end of my story. I can change, I can grow, I can be part of this larger movement for change. I got to speak in Atlanta next to a woman named Zernona Clayton, who was a civil rights activist during the time of King. And she said, you know, I didn't march with King, but I organized the marches. You know, so she's another remarkable story about her is that she got to know a grand dragon of the KKK. And they got into this close relationship with each other. And he came to her office one time and, you know, they're having these conversations. And, you know, she says, well, you know, Mr. Craig, I got to get going. I've got a dinner party. And he said, you know, you're having people over to your house. Who are you having? And she starts listing off these white people that she's having over. And the guy says, well, you know, Miss Clayton, I could never eat dinner at your house. I'm sorry. And she said, Mr. Clayton, I've never invited you to dinner at my place. But she goes on to talk about how in having this relationship, he eventually abandons his role and travels the country with her to refute the KKK and to talk about different ways of living. So just that story of change, showing that even a person who is closely connected to white nationalism and white supremacy can change their life. And all of us who feel that, well, you know, I'm not an activist or I'm not out there able to do a lot of real change, there's so much change that we can do even in our own little spheres of influence, the ways that we interact with our friends and family and places of work. So each one of us has the opportunity to change and to make a difference where we are.
Could you talk about stereotyping and how it plays into racism where does it depart from observations and where does it become stereotyping in an invalid and not good way?
There's a saying that Emmanuel Larty told me that's from some other anthropologists, but he says each person is like no other, some others, and all others. And talking about the difference between multiracial or multiculturalism and intercultural pastoral care, he talked about how it's important for us to value different cultures, and the multicultural movement was really trying to identify that these are distinct cultures and they have these different, characteristics, and we need to celebrate them. But that can lead to stereotyping. Everybody from this culture does X, Y, or Z. And then we all assume that we know everything about these people. Well, we know this one person, and that person is like no other. So how can we get to know them and their story? And then that person is also like some others. Maybe, they have some similarities with, some other, if it's a woman, some other women, maybe with the social class that he or she comes from, with, the sexual orientation that she identifies with, all these other, she identifies with some people. And then at the same time, she also is like all others. We all have these hearts, these lungs that are breathing in this air. We all are human, and being able to identify that. So in terms of the question of stereotyping, I think it's important that we always say, well, I know this about this one person. I know this about these people that I've met before. I'm now seeing someone who looks like them, but they may be totally different. So how can I just relate to them as I would a new neighbor, and how would I, ask them about their life and anything, what are you doing these days? What fills your time, and kind of get to know them in a way that I would anybody else. So I think it can be tricky, because a lot of people can feel overwhelmed with, I don't want to stereotype, but it's also easy for us to be able to be in relationship with one another and make mistakes, and let people say, that's kind of a stereotype, and let them call us out on that, and to be okay with that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Can
you see me? No, all this calls come back.
I'll swivel. Oh, this is us. Yeah, Carolyn, I'm swiveling.
Hope that doesn't make you busy. So I want to kind of play off of Brand's question about guilt a little bit, and let me do it with the story. I have a minister friend who's been a minister of the church in the area for probably 20 years. It's an inner city church, and he's an older white guy, and the church originated, how it originated as a white congregation. As time has evolved, the community has changed. So he came to me the other day talking about he's getting ready to retire, and so he was saying that that what the church needs is a Spanish-speaking minister. Now, so I'd like to get your impression of that in this regard. So, what's the difference between prejudice and preference? Okay, because it seems to me that those are not the same things, but it might be a wedge that we could ust as white, as Anglo, to address racist and prejudice issues.
Yeah, I think there's a lot hidden in our preferences in terms of our implicit bias, kind of operating without us really knowing, that there's a lot of things that, again, we may assume only people who look just like us have gifts that we need and want. And so opening our eyes to, different expressions of that. So I'm going back to that question about the Spanish-speaking minister. what was kind of your sense of that? Where were you going with that?
So the church has struggled all the way, for years and years and years, because as the white congregation grows older and gets smaller, the church right now is not growing, and so I think it's his feeling that if there was a Latino or Latinx minister that was Spanish speaking, that it would help the church to grow. So I was using that as a wedge to talk about the difference between prejudice and preference, because it seems to me that someone could prefer something and not be prejudiced.
Yeah, like going to different churches depending on who's in leadership. That kind of line of thinking. I'm trying to track with you.
Yeah. So it's pardon me. It seems that the even the idea of your comment on stereotyping. So let me ask a question a different way. So are you saying that stereotyping is always negative?
I think it's useful in some ways. I mean, when we talk about stereotypes, it's often we make assumptions like, okay, this is a donut. I am already aware that that donut is probably the same caloric, content as the other donut I've had all the other times. And so you're instantly making a stereotype that this donut is going to, be as bad for me as all the other donuts. Unless you see a sign to the other way, and you find out, oh, this donut is actually gluten-free, dairy-free, wheat-free, wonderful, So in some ways, it's kind of our biological, evolution that we kind of make split judgments based on past knowledge. Is because if we were always processing things brand new, it would be really, really slow. But when it comes to people, those implicit kind of quick judgments, when you've had, a certain amount of people that are, in the most powerful positions, who hold the most wealth, who've kind of been able to pass that wealth down and continue to be able to give people jobs. If those people are constantly going to their preferences, it perpetuates this kind of homogeneity because people are going towards what they know, what they're used to, what they're familiar with. So stereotypes, in a kind of benign sense, can be just ways that we make meaning quickly in the world. But it's also it can be deadly in the real sense that for persons for whom the stereotype is that their body is a threat. African American young men who are viewed as a threat just because they're out on the street at night and they're Black. Those kinds of stereotypes lead to those young men being more targeted.
Yeah. So what's the criteria? Stereotyping can be good, can be bad. Preferences can be good, can be bad. So what is the criteria for when someone crosses the line?
I think the ultimate criteria is relationship. And if you're in relationship with someone and you're making assumptions about them and they prefer that you not make those assumptions, then hopefully they will let you know. So it's not something that we're good at deciding on our own because of our own blinders. So it's always relationship. It's always communication. Because what one person, feels fine with you saying around them, another person might, feel really hurt by it. So it just depends. But in the church example, there's a lot of different things there, because there have been churches that are segregated and churches that are predominantly of one ethnicity. Say in a town in Austin, if there's a Spanish-speaking church of persons who are immigrants from Mexico. For instance, that isn't necessarily just about preference or prejudice, but it's also about solidarity and support in a context in which they're constantly threatened. And so feeling like you're with people who get what you get all the time, who understand that. So on the one hand, there are groups that look like, well, they're just sticking with their own, or, they're not integrating. But it's often because they're already marginalized in society and they need a place to be able to recharge and not constantly feel the hostility that they feel in other places. So for your friend who's looking for a Spanish-speaking pastor, I think having a second language, or having Spanish as the language of your pastor, is always a plus. So whatever that person looks like, they may be Latinx, or they may be German, who knows. But having someone who speaks Spanish, but who can also relate to the needs of the community. So if the community is of a particular ethnicity, then sometimes that does help to be able to let people know, I know a little bit about what you go through. Again, it's the issue of stereotypes. You can't just assume you know everything that someone's going through, but there's that hope that we can kind of understand a little bit.
Thank you.
I know we're running low on time. Did anyone else have one more question?
Can we go back to that idea of so a leader or a leadership group that is always or often going to what they prefer, that could lead to perpetuating prejudice or racism without them even knowing.
Yes. Yeah.
Speak to leadership groups about.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people who talk about diversity and issues of trying to make sure that your hiring practices are fair. And some people worry that that's all about like political correctness or checking a box. But really, it is to try to overcome those initial affinities that we automatically have with people who look like us. And so if you are in a hiring position, often you'll go to the people that you feel you can most relate to, you can most connect with. And so having the awareness that there are people with very different gifts than I have, and I may not automatically look to them and see them as just the person that we need, but we need to keep looking. We need to keep our eyes open to see what gifts others have to give. So it's definitely easy for us to keep just saying, oh, well, we've hired, white men the last, 12 hires. Well, that's just because these have been the most qualified candidates, and maybe, but there also could be a lot of really strong candidates that were overlooked because they looked different and had different sounding names and things like that. So hope that answers your question. Okay, well, go ahead.
I just have one more question that I would love to just leave people, or maybe people that are listening to this later with, since your book is anxious to talk about it, we've all kind of in our first couple of weeks talked about how there is a lot of tension when talking about race, and we're living in a really bizarre time in history where there's just kind of this resurgence of anxiety around racial injustice, and all the things that are kind of going on in the media at this point. What are ways, because I feel like, and you address it in your book a little bit, where people can have that stage where they just decide to kind of opt out of the conversation. They're like, I've got my own problems, I've got my own issues, especially, I'm particularly talking about white people at this point. And how have you found, in your experience, ways to kind of break through that type of person who's in that stage where they just don't want to talk about it and they feel like they have their own problems, and they don't live in an area maybe where they have a lot of relationships with people with diversity, so there's not even that type of opportunity a lot of times for them to kind of put themselves in someone else's shoes at a personal level. How have you found that struggle in your experience in your work? I'd love to know.
Yeah, I try to lead with gratitude, and I try to lead with my own gratitude for the relationships that I've built and have met through different experiences, and to be able to share that with others. So I'm not trying to come into a conversation where I know all the answers, and this is, I'm the right person, you're the wrong person. It's always just I have this great story of sharing the beauty of a relationship that can happen when we go there, when we get deep with one another, when we are able to connect. And I want that for other people, and I want other people to also feel seen and heard in their experiences. So letting gratitude be kind of that rooting metaphor and a motivator for me helps me kind of think about, how do I want to talk about this? How do I want to bring it into the conversation? So, for instance, at my kids' school, recently, there was a mom who I talked to who was like, yeah, we moved to Austin many years ago. We were originally from Nigeria, and we've been to this school, over a year, but I felt invisible, saying hi to people, and nobody would even say anything back. So hearing that story, and then I went to the principal and I was like, it would be really great if we could talk about race and talk about how we can be more inclusive and seeing one another and seeing the gifts of one another. So in a few weeks, I'll be doing a thing called the Gifts of Diversity. So focusing on, again, the gifts that we receive from one another, and parents are invited to attend, and parents with kids with special needs, a lot of different ways that we can see diversity and played out. But we're hoping to have a good conversation. So any way that you can use your own circle of influence, wherever that may be, whether it's at your kid's school or your church or, your place of work or your neighborhood, your HOA or your neighborhood association, all of those places, you can make a little difference. I was with Metropolitan Community Church of Austin on Sunday afternoon, and I gave them all a task. I said, I want you to use the word racism sometime this week. I want you to kind of have a conversation and use that word, and then just see what happens. See what is going on in you, feel about your own feelings, and be open to the feelings of the other person. So I might just leave that there as a gift for you all to consider. Since I won't be meeting next week with you all, I won't be able to ask you about it, but just something to consider. So it's so good to see all of you, especially Xochitl. Really wonderful to see you, and many blessings to you all as you continue to study and continue in ministry.
Thank you so much for really enjoying it.
And